"Ma'am, you need to vacate this property immediately or we're calling the police for trespassing." That's what woke me at 2 a.m. on October 15th when I found 3 HOA board members and a security guard standing in my backyard with flashlights, claiming I was illegally camping on association property, the same property my grandfather bought in 1952, the same land where I'd just installed a small shed to store my disability equipment. They were pointing at my Silver Star license plate and laughing about fake military wannabes when the quiet neighbor from 2 streets over stepped out of the shadows and saw my unit tattoo. His face went white as a sheet. "Holy shit," he whispered. "3rd Infantry Division, Ramadi 2006. Ma'am, are you Sergeant Sarah Miller?" The HOA president's smug expression crumbled as she realized she'd just made the biggest mistake of her pathetic little power-hungry life. "I'm Sarah Miller, and this is how I destroyed the most corrupt HOA in Virginia using nothing but the truth, a few legal documents, and the respect of fellow veterans who understood what those scars on my hands really meant." Where are you watching from? Drop a comment, because this revenge story, chef's kiss perfect. This story starts with my grandfather, Technical Sergeant Robert Miller, who came home from World War II with shrapnel in his left leg and a Purple Heart he never talked about. He used his GI Bill to buy a 3-acre lot in what was then rural Fairfax County, Virginia, rolling hills, old-growth oak trees, and a creek that ran clear enough to drink from. He built our family home with his own hands, every board and nail a testament to the American dream he'd fought to defend. Grandpa would sit on the front porch every evening, watching the sunset paint the sky purple and gold, telling me stories about the importance of land ownership. "Sarah girl," he'd say, "this proper tie represents 3 generations of Miller sacrifice. Your daddy served in Vietnam, I served in the Pacific, and someday you'll serve too. But this land is permanent. This is what we're really fighting for, the right to build something lasting for our families." The original deed, dated March 12, 1952, was crystal clear. Lot 47A, Fairfax County, Virginia, 3.2 acres, mineral rights included, no restrictions except standard county zoning. No homeowners association, no covenants, no restrictions beyond basic county ordinances. Grandpa paid $3 cash for that land, money he'd saved from his military pay over 6 years of service. He planted those oak trees himself, dug the well by hand, and built the stone walls that still mark our property boundaries today. When developers started circling in the 1980s, offering big money for the surrounding farmland, Grandpa refused every offer. "They can build their fancy houses around us," he told my dad, "but Millerland stays Millerland." He was right about the development. Pine Ridge estates sprouted up like mushrooms, McMansions packed tight as sardines, each one costing more than Grandpa had paid for our entire property. Dad raised me to understand that military service was a Miller family tradition, not an obligation. "Your grandfather served because he had to," he'd explain. "I served because I chose to. You'll serve because you understand what freedom costs." He was right. I enlisted in the Army in 2001, straight out of high school, determined to uphold the family tradition of service before self. Military Police, 503rd MP Battalion, attached to 3rd Infantry Division, 2 tours in Iraq, 2005 and 2006. I was good at my job, maintaining order, protecting supply convoys, training Iraqi police forces. I thought I was invincible, right up until July 15th, 2006, when our Humvee hit an IED in Ramadi and my world exploded in fire and shrapnel. I pulled 3 soldiers out of that burning vehicle, including Specialist Michael Kelly from Montana. The second blast caught me as I was dragging Kelly to safety, left me with 3rd-degree burns covering 30% of my body. 8 months in military hospitals, 12 surgeries, and a medical discharge with full disability benefits. The Army gave me a Silver Star for heroism, but medals don't make people stop staring at your scars. I came home to Virginia in 2008, 26 years old, permanently disabled, and struggling to figure out how to live as a civilian. The property became my refuge, 3 acres of peace where I could heal without judgment, where the oak trees Grandpa planted provided shade for my darkest moments. I used my VA benefits to add accessibility features to the house, ramps, wider doorways, grab bars in the bathroom. The disability payments covered basic expenses, but I lived simply, maintaining the property myself as much as possible. Those oak trees needed constant care, the stone walls required regular maintenance, and the old well needed periodic service. Physical therapy disguised as property maintenance. Every day I spent working on Grandpa's land made me a little stronger, a little more whole. The trouble started in 2018 when Pine Ridge Estates decided they wanted to professionalize their community management. Translation: they hired Prestige Property Management, a company that specializes in aggressive HOA enforcement, to take over from the volunteer board that had been running things quiet, live for 30 years. Suddenly, the neighborhood had new rules, new fees, and new attitude about what constituted appropriate property standards. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a certified letter dated September 3, 2018, informing me that my property had been incorporated into the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and that I owed $3,200 in back dues, plus penalties and interest. The letter was signed by Charlotte Westbrook, the new HOA president, a woman who had moved to the neighborhood 2 years earlier and apparently decided that her mission in life was to make everyone else as miserable as she was. I called the county clerk's office immediately. My property had never been part of any HOA. The deed was clear, the title was clean, and there were no covenants or restrictions filed against my lot. But Charlotte Westbrook wasn't interested in legal documents or property records. She was interested in power, and my 3 acres of non-conforming property were apparently an eyesore that lowered everyone else's property values. The harassment started small. Notices about inappropriate fence height for stone walls that had been there since 1952, complaints about unauthorized agricultural use because I grew vegetables in my backyard, citations for non-conforming mailbox placement because my mailbox was wooden instead of the approved plastic model that every other house in the development used. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine came with a threat of legal action if not paid within 30 days. Charlotte Westbrook was like a dog with a bone. Once she decided I was the enemy, she became obsessed with finding ways to force me into compliance. She was everything I despised about civilian authority. Petty, vindictive, and drunk on the small amount of power she'd managed to accumulate. Former real estate agent, currently unemployed, married to a pharmaceutical sales rep who traveled constantly. She'd found her purpose in life running the HOA like her personal fiefdom. The violations escalated quickly. In October 2018, I received a citation for unauthorized outdoor storage because I kept my lawnmower in a small storage shed behind the house. The shed had been there since 1975, built by my dad when he returned from Vietnam, but according to Charlotte, it violated the visual harmony standards of the community. The fine was $200, with an additional $50 per day until the non-conforming structure was removed. November brought complaints about my excessive landscaping. The oak trees Grandpa planted were allegedly blocking sightlines and creating safety hazards for neighboring properties. Charlotte demanded I trim them back or remove them entirely, despite the fact that they were clearly on my property and had been there for over 60 years. The arborist she hired to assess the situation quoted $8,000 for professional tree management services that would essentially destroy everything my grandfather had built. December was when things got personal. Charlotte somehow discovered that I was a disabled veteran receiving VA benefits, and she started making comments about welfare recipients who couldn't afford to properly maintain their properties. She suggested at the monthly HOA meeting that the association should have the right to acquire and improve properties that didn't meet community standards, essentially forcing me to sell or face endless legal battles. The psychological warfare began in earnest in early 2019. Stimayon. Charlotte had turned the monthly HOA meetings into public shaming sessions where she'd display photographs of my property and invite neighbors to comment on how my non-compliance was affecting their property values. She'd hired a professional photographer to document every aspect of my land, zooming in on peeling paint, overgrown grass, and the unsightly disability ramp I'd installed to access my front door. The social pressure was intense. Neighbors who'd waved hello for years suddenly avoided eye contact when I checked my mail. The woman across the street, whose kids I'd helped with their science fair projects, started pulling her curtains closed when she saw me in the yard. The couple next door, who had always been friendly, suddenly installed a privacy fence along our shared property line and stopped returning my phone calls. Charlotte's husband, David Westbrook, worked for a pharmaceutical company and had connections throughout the region. He started making calls to local contractors, spreading word that I was litigious and difficult to work with. Suddenly, getting quotes for routine property maintenance became nearly impossible. The landscaping company that had been servicing my property for 5 years abruptly canceled their contract, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone knew were really about avoiding HOA retaliation. The mail carrier, Mrs. Rodriguez, was one of the few people who still treated me with respect. She'd been delivering mail to my address for 12 years and remembered my grandfather. "That woman is poison," she whispered one afternoon, referring to Charlotte. "She's been asking questions about your mail, your packages, your visitors. I told her it was none of her business, but she's obsessed with you. You need to be careful. If you're seeing the same HOA power games in your neighborhood, drop Karen alert in the comments. This gets so much worse before it gets better, but sometimes the biggest bullies make the biggest mistakes." The turning point came in March 2019. When Charlotte made her first truly illegal move. She filed a complaint with the county zoning department claiming that I was operating an unlicensed salvage yard on my property. The complaint included photographs of my disability equipment, a motorized wheelchair, a modified ATV I used for property maintenance, and various tools and supplies stored in my shed. She claimed these items constituted industrial equipment that violated residential zoning restrictions. The county inspector, Bill Martinez, was a veteran himself, Army Corps of Engineers, 2 tours in Afghanistan. He took one look at my property, checked the original deed, and immediately saw what Charlotte was trying to do. "Ma'am," he told me, "this complaint is baseless. You're not operating any kind of business here, and medical equipment isn't subject to zoning restrictions anyway. But I have to document everything officially. So, if you'll walk me through what you've got, I'll write up a report that should shut this down." Bill's report was thorough and damning. He documented that my property was in full compliance with all county regulations, that there were no zoning violations, and that the complainant appeared to be motivated by personal animosity rather than legitimate concern for code compliance. He also noted that my property was not subject to HOA jurisdiction, and that their attempts to enforce association rules on my land were legally questionable at best. Charlotte's response to Bill's report was to hire a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. She hired Rothschild Associates, a firm that specialized in aggressive property law enforcement and had a reputation for destroying people who couldn't afford to fight back. The initial demand letter arrived on April 15, 2019, claiming that I owed $47,000 in accumulated fines and legal fees, plus immediate compliance with all HOA regulations or face foreclosure proceedings. That legal threat was Charlotte's first major mistake, because it forced me to start thinking like a soldier again, instead of a victim. I'd been reacting to her attacks instead of planning my own offensive, and that needed to change. Military police training teaches you to gather intelligence before you move, to understand your enemy's weaknesses before you strike. Time to put that training to use. I started with the public records. Every document Charlotte had filed, every complaint she'd made, every legal proceeding she'd initiated was a matter of public record. I spent 3 weeks at the county courthouse, copying files, tracing property histories, and documenting the paper trail of her harassment campaign. What I found was a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond my property. Charlotte had been systematically targeting anyone who didn't conform to her vision of community perfection. The Martinez family had been fined $12,000 for inappropriate holiday decorations because they had left Christmas lights up past January 15th. The Johnsons had been cited for non-conforming pet ownership because their dog was a pit bull mix rather than an approved breed. The elderly Kowalski couple had been forced to remove a memorial garden they'd built for their deceased son because it violated landscaping uniformity standards. Every case followed the same pattern: escalating fines, legal threats, and attempts to force compliance through financial pressure. But the real breakthrough came when I started researching Charlotte herself. Turns out she'd been playing these games for years, moving from one HOA to another, always seeking positions of authority where she could exercise power over others. Her previous association in Richmond had actually removed her from the board after complaints about harassment and financial irregularities. She had been forced to resign from her real estate license after multiple ethics violations. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about a woman who'd found her calling as a neighborhood tyrant. I also discovered that Prestige Property Management had been operating under questionable legal authority. Their contract with the HOA was expired, their business license had lapsed, and they'd been filing legal documents without proper authorization. Charlotte had been essentially operating as a rogue agent, using the HOA's name and resources to pursue her personal vendettas against neighbors she disliked. The evidence against Charlotte was overwhelming, but I needed allies to make it stick. The first person I contacted was Bill Martinez, the county inspector who had seen through her zoning complaint. He connected me with the county attorney's office, which had been receiving complaints about Prestige Property Management's aggressive tactics. Turns out, I wasn't the only one fighting back. Several other homeowners had filed formal complaints about HOA overreach and illegal enforcement actions. My next call was to the Virginia Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation, which oversees property management companies. They were very interested in my documentation of Prestige's expired licenses and unauthorized legal filings. They opened an investigation that ultimately led to the company losing its business license and facing significant fines for fraudulent practice. The breakthrough came when I connected with other veterans in the neighborhood. I'd been so focused on my own problems that I hadn't realized how many military families lived in Pine Ridge Estates. There was Master Sergeant James Wilson, retired Marines, Captain Lisa Chen, Army Reserve, and Senior Airman Mike Rodriguez, Air Force, recently separated. All of them had been experiencing various forms of HOA harassment, and all of them were ready to fight back once they understood the scope of Charlotte's illegal activities. We formed what we called the Pine Ridge Patriots, an informal group of military families who were tired of being bullied by a power-hungry HOA president. We shared information, coordinated legal strategies, and provided mutual support during what we knew would be a long campaign. Having battle-tested allies made all the difference in the world. We understood discipline, we understood strategy, and we understood that sometimes you have to fight for what's right. By summer 2010, I had assembled a legal case that would have made my old JAG officers proud. 3 binders full of evidence, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by violation type. Public records showing Charlotte's pattern of harassment across multiple properties. Financial documents proving that Prestige Property Management had been operating without proper licensing. Expert testimony from county inspectors, property lawyers, and veterans advocacy groups. The smoking gun was a recording I'd made of Charlotte's presentation at the July HOA meeting. She'd gotten careless, drunk on her own power, and started making statements about cleaning out undesirable elements in the neighborhood. She specifically mentioned welfare recipients and people who don't belong in our community while displaying photographs of my property. The recording was crystal clear, legally obtained, and absolutely devastating to her credibility. My lawyer, David Kim, was a former Army JAG officer who specialized in veterans' rights cases. He reviewed my evidence and smiled, the first time I'd seen him smile since we'd started working together. "Sarah," he said, "this isn't just a property dispute anymore. This is a federal civil rights case. Charlotte has been systematically targeting you because of your disability status, your military service, and your family's long-term property ownership. She's violated the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and probably half a dozen other federal statutes. We filed a comprehensive lawsuit in federal court, claiming violations of my civil rights, harassment based on disability status, and conspiracy to deprive me of property rights. We also filed complaints with the Virginia Attorney General's Office, the Federal Fair Housing Administration, and the Department of Veterans Affairs. The goal wasn't just to stop Charlotte's harassment. It was to make sure she could never do this to anyone else again. The October 20 HOA meeting was standing room only. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood that something big was happening, and residents who hadn't attended a meeting in years showed up to see the fireworks. Charlotte had scheduled a special presentation about property compliance enforcement, apparently planning to use the meeting to announce new legal actions against me and several other homeowners. She never got the chance. David Kim and I arrived with our federal lawsuit, our evidence binders, and a court-appointed mediator who had been assigned to oversee the proceedings. Charlotte's face went white when she saw the legal documents, but she tried to maintain her composure as she called the meeting to order. "Before we begin tonight's scheduled presentation," David announced, "I need to serve notice that federal legal proceedings have been initiated against this HOA, its management company, and several individual board members. All enforcement actions against my client's property must cease immediately, and any further harassment will result in additional federal charges." The room erupted. Neighbors who had been quietly suffering under Charlotte's tyranny suddenly found their voices. The Martinez family stood up to describe their $12,000 fine for holiday decorations. The Johnsons talked about being forced to get rid of their family dog. The Kowalskis, both in their 70s, broke down crying as they described having to remove their son's memorial garden. Charlotte tried to maintain control, banging her gavel and demanding order, but the dam had burst. Master Sergeant Wilson stood up and delivered a speech about American values and property rights that brought the house down. Captain Chen read a prepared statement about the sacrifices military families had made for the freedoms that Charlotte was trying to destroy. By the time Senior Airman Rodriguez finished explaining how HOA harassment had affected his family's mental health, Charlotte was finished. The legal dominoes fell quickly after that meeting. Within 2 weeks, Prestige Property Management had been shut down by the state regulatory agency. Charlotte was removed from the HOA board by a unanimous vote of the membership. The association's insurance company canceled their liability coverage, citing excessive risk exposure from illegal enforcement actions. 3 other homeowners filed federal lawsuits similar to mine, creating a class action scenario that the HOA couldn't afford to fight. Charlotte's personal life imploded just as dramatically. Her husband, David, filed for divorce after learning about the financial exposure from her illegal activities. The pharmaceutical company fired him when they discovered the extent of his involvement in the harassment campaign. The couple's house went into foreclosure within 6 months, forcing them to move out of the neighborhood they'd tried so hard to control. But the real satisfaction came from the federal settlement. The HOA agreed to pay $250,000 in damages to affected homeowners, implement new oversight procedures, and provide mandatory training for all board members. Charlotte personally was banned from serving on any HOA board in Virginia and required to pay $50,000 in punitive damages. More importantly, the settlement established legal precedent that would protect other homeowners from similar harassment campaigns. The neighborhood transformation was remarkable. The new HOA board, elected by residents who'd been galvanized by Charlotte's abuses, focused on genuine community improvement rather than petty enforcement. They organized neighborhood barbecues, started a community garden, and created a veterans support group that met monthly at the community center. Property values actually increased once the toxic atmosphere of harassment and litigation was removed. Today, my property is exactly as my grandfather intended it to be, a peaceful refuge where 3 generations of Miller family sacrifice is honored and protected. The oak trees he planted provide shade for neighborhood children who play in the creek. The stone walls he built by hand mark boundaries that will never again be challenged by petty tyrants. The American flag flies proudly over land that represents everything worth fighting for. The legal victory was complete, but the personal victory was even more meaningful. I'd proven that disabled veterans deserve respect, that family legacy matters, and that bullies can be defeated when good people stand together. The Pine Ridge Patriots continue to meet monthly, providing support for military families and ensuring that no one else will ever face the kind of harassment Charlotte Westbrook tried to inflict. Michael Kelly, the soldier I'd saved in Iraq, found me 6 months after the legal settlement. He'd been searching for me for years, following news reports about veterans' rights cases. "I heard about your fight with the HOA," he told me. "I wanted to thank you again for saving my life, but more than that, I wanted to thank you for showing everyone what real courage looks like. You didn't just fight for your property, you fought for everyone's right to be treated with dignity." The story went viral on social media, inspiring other homeowners to stand up against HOA abuse. I've received hundreds of messages from military families, disabled veterans, and ordinary citizens who found the courage to fight back against their own neighborhood tyrants. The lesson is simple. Bullies count on their victims being isolated and afraid, but when people unite and fight back with the truth, justice always wins. Charlotte Westbrook is gone, but the principles she represented, petty tyranny, abuse of power, and contempt for American values, still exist in HOA boards across the country. If you're facing similar harassment, document everything, find allies, and never give up. Your property rights, your dignity, and your freedom are worth fighting for. Drop a comment if you've ever had to fight an HOA or if you know a veteran who deserves recognition for their service. The world needs more people willing to stand up for what's right, and fewer people willing to abuse whatever small amount of power they have been given. My grandfather would be proud of what we accomplished here, and my scars remind me every day that some battles are worth fighting, no matter what they cost. Freedom isn't free, and sometimes you have to defend it against enemies foreign and domestic. Today, my property is secure, my rights are protected, and my family's legacy is preserved for future generations. That's what victory looks like, and that's what happens when Americans refuse to surrender to tyranny, no matter how petty or local it might be.